mic's not on. Mic on? Okay. Sorry, everybody. We had a little technical issues we had to work through. So apologize. We'll come back from recess.
All right.
And
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and just confirming once more, everybody ready? Shelley, you ready? All good, everything? All right, thank you again. Okay, moving forward from where we were, and let me just confirm, do we have any participants still on the phone line? I don't think so. Okay, good. All right, moving forward now to a couple other sheets that you have in your packets. You should have one that looks like this that you've seen before, which is a summary of the key results from the various actuarial reports. You've seen that previously. And just to recap the results between CAVMAC, GRS, and Chiron, we're all very similar to last year and similar across the three reports, with the actuarial funded ratio being roughly 56% and the unfunded liability being roughly 26 billion and the actuarially determined contribution, or ADEC, being roughly 26% as well. And you can see in the left column under CAVMAC is one of 25.92 that I'll comment on in just a moment, further in just a moment. And then I'll call your attention to this sheet that you should have received before, which is an estimate of the cost to increase the employer contribution rate from the current rate of 17.9 to the actuarially determined contribution rate of 25.92, or the ADC from CAVMAC. This is put together in a format similar to what we've used in the past. It's just an estimate, of course, for discussion purposes, but gives you an idea in the aggregate from a summary standpoint on what those potential changes would reflect in terms of dollars coming into the system on an annual basis. As you can see over to the right, this, I guess, incremental increase of the estimated 8.02 difference going up from the current 17.9 to the 25.92. You see that in total of approximately $616 million across the various employers to the left. Down below is the same type of information, but just only for what we call the state-funded entities, which that's leaving out mainly the cities and counties. And you can see that's around $472 million. The middle column is put in there for additional information, which is intended to estimate the 0.5% increase going up to the 18.4. But the far right-hand column, I think, is the main one of focus. On this topic, I think it's also important to remember something that comes up from time to time, and something that board members often inquire about or mention, and that is the fact that while these are just estimates, they should be good estimates on an annual basis across, irrespective of fund source. It's important to keep in mind that a smaller percentage of this will come from state general funds. This is total, again, irrespective of fund source, but we looked a couple of years ago, we did a project in looking at that, and I think we estimated that around a third comes from state general funds. And of course, that's been a couple of years, it was just an estimate. Some may think that's low, some may think that's high, but that's just the main theme, though, and one of the main points is that a large amount comes from fund sources other than state general funds. The state general funds is going to be a lower amount. And that brings me to talk a little bit about the percent of payroll method. The percent of payroll method is something that we use, very common, and many other states use it. And I think one of the reasons that is common is because it allows the state and the agencies and so forth to legally and appropriately use those federal or other funds or other special funds to help fund the pension system. There certainly are some considerations involved, but that's one of the reasons that percent of payroll method is popular in my belief. Lastly on that, I will say I saw portions online of a recent state fiscal type committee and saw some of the presentation. I was doing other things at the time, but I believe from that the elbow staff had a presentation, and one part of that I think estimated the increase to the 25% approximately, I think was around 240 million. They had two different numbers, as I recall. Definitely don't want to speak for them, but I believe that's what their number was, and I believe they were intended to represent the estimate for just state general funds. Now, certainly the budget office and DFA, for that matter, their estimate would be the best one in that regard, because they know the state general funds and they know fund sources more and have access to stuff that we wouldn't. We've worked, but they definitely would have the good estimate. But I seem to remember it was around 240 million or so. They had two different versions in state general fund. So I just share that with you as information, definitely not speaking for them, but it's something that I heard and I wanted to share it. And then if you think of that in the context of the roughly a third or a small amount, if you think about it, the 200-something million into the 616 million, that's,
So it would be fair to say that, excuse me, I've got to change my hearing aid so I don't
Sure.
hear my echo. So it would be safe to say, rather than where the asterisk is, instead of a portion of funding, that we could say approximately 70% of this funding would come from special or federal funds?
You could, based on what I said. I wouldn't say that, just because I'd rather be a little, on our document that we hand out, I put it that way intentionally to be a little more broad. But I can understand, you know, why you come to that conclusion based on what we've discussed now and in the past.
I would prefer that we put an amount in there, because a portion could mean anything from 1%. That would be fine, but right now, our numbers is approximately 70% of this funding would come from federal or special funds. I would prefer that we put that approximately 70% in there, and then maybe these other agencies would help us get that, precise, more precise amount.
Well, we can do that. And it may end up being closer to approximately 60, but if agreeable, what I'll do is I'll find or look up that chart that I was talking about and seek to confirm it with Elbow or the author of it, and then add some wording that says something to that effect and kind of cover what you're talking about. If that's agreeable, we can do
Well,
that.
we could, like our funding policy, we can just put a red line through it
Yeah.
and say approximately.
Sure. So we certainly can do that. And then I wanted to share that as information, and I'll go ahead and say now, even though there could be more discussion, but what I would like to do is recommend, my recommendation to you is that the board's recommendation to the legislature as far as funding and the employer contribution is to follow the actuary's recommendation and to recommend the actuarially determined contribution, or ADEC, of 25.92% of payroll as calculated by CAVMAC, supported by the other two additional independent actuarial assessments that come in very close to that, and that ADEC be the recommendation that we provide to the legislature. Or certainly there are other aspects where if they want to continue to phase it in, I think in CAVMAC's report, there's some numbers there as well. So anything I think consistent with those actuarial recommendations would be sufficient. But my suggestion and recommendation to you would be that the board recommend the 25.92 as the ADEC for the employer contribution rate. And I think that's the best thing to do for a variety of reasons now, but one main aspect being due to the recent change in the law, because under the current law that was passed last year, the implementation of that rate is in the authority of the legislature. So that would be my recommendation. I'm happy to answer any questions.
I think that are you asking us to take action on that right now?
I would like for you to consider taking action today, not necessarily right now, but I am hopeful that the board would act on that.
I would prefer that we wait until after we hear, because I think our actuary actually has two other scenarios for us to consider. So I would prefer that we delay any action on that until we hear from our actuary.
Well, and to add to that, any other recommendations, if there are any, Ed, which I don't necessarily remember any, but any and all of the recommendations, unless the board decides to pick a few that they don't want to support or we want to hash it out that way. But otherwise, it does seem cleaner that if the board wants to consider the approval of those recommendations be submitted to the legislature, it could just be through the entire report and the recommendations be adopted that are of the actuary and within the report. Not just this one in particular, which I know is the larger one, but so I don't disagree with that, Dr. McCoy.
So on that, we certainly can do that, no problem. Certainly defer to the chairman and the committee, and I don't have any concerns with that. The only thing I would say, if I'm hearing part of it and understanding it right, is on the part that I recommended. In that respect, I think we've already heard from the actuary. That's the result of the valuation presented at the last meeting and approved moments ago. And I think regardless of any of those scenarios that we'll talk about today and in the future, I think the ADEC is going to be the same, and the recommendations for funding. And I think funding is going to be an important part irrespective of any tier 5 or any other scenarios. And that's not to disagree. I'm just kind of trying to distinguish the difference between the funding and the working session about to ensue.
Right. Won't hurt to wait, I'll say.
No.
I don't think. And I don't think we're gonna change Ed's mind.
Yeah, sure. That's right.
Say that too. So, we may, but I doubt it. So,
Challenge.
Commissioner?
Our approval, if we approve this, that also includes the cities, the counties, the school systems,
That's everybody.
which, everybody.
Well, yes, sir. Well, it's basically, if it were approved as a recommendation to the legislature, then it would be the legislature's decision on how that would be done or to who or whatever. I mean, I guess our recommendation would be blanketed as payroll, that percentage, if it did get approved by the board.
And I don't know if there's any easy answer, but to see these figures that they've given us, that my school system has got to come up with over $3.5 million more money. That's a lot of money to come up with, but I don't know what the answer to it is, if we're gonna have a solvent system.
Commissioner Dale, that's one of the reasons I wanted to hear from the actuary. Last year, in the wisdom of this board, we recommended that the 10% essentially actuarial raise in taxes to the agencies and units out there. We said, well, we're gonna raise it 5% over 3 years. We were gonna pause. And then we were going to reevaluate and make a decision on the next 5%. Well, if the wisdom of this board was such that we were recommending phasing that in, why wouldn't we recommend phasing in the next part? So I just wanted to hear from the actuary to see what his was. And I'm like the director, I don't think it's gonna change the end number. What it's gonna change is our recommendation to the legislature as to how they get to that number. And once they get our recommendation, they could just say, oh, well, we're not gonna do the full taxes, we're gonna do a diversion and put 200 million in a year for whatever years to, but I just wanna get to the actuary and hear that, because I think we can still recommend with that tag number of that 25% out there, we can still do the tag out there, but we would recommend to the legislature that we would do it this way. It's what we would have done if we still had that authority. That's what we would do. And that's kind of the way I'm looking at our recommendations now, so.
Dr. McCoy answered my question. I was going to ask the staff to update us on what we had done in the past, because I was reading whenever you were talking, I was afraid I missed it. So we were going to take it to 22.4 over 5 years. I just forgot the interval.
2 and 3 years.
It was over
3 years.
3 years.
Oh, yeah, that's right. I read 3 years.
2 and
Okay.
whatever the remainder needed to be.
Okay. So that was the action that we took.
The one might have been a
Before the
little
law
higher by the
changed.
time we
Yeah,
got there.
before the law
Okay.
changed.
Yes.
And just to recap that further, and feel free to, anybody to add more or amend this. That is correct. It was, my dates and years may be a little bit off, but, the 22.4% came from a previous valuation with an assumed rate of return at 7.55. It was recommended to 22.4, which the board voted to go forward. And then I think subsequently voted to phase it in like was just described in the roughly 3 years. Also last year.
And when we made that final vote, did we already have the recommendation that reflected it could go as high as 27 and some change?
I was about to say that, and I want to speak to that.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, I'm sorry, I don't know. Y'all go ahead. Whoever, go ahead.
Actually, the actuary had recommended that it go all the way to that. The board, I think, decided we would pause it at the middle and then consider the rest of the Now, Ed, am I kind of saying what you had recommended and we did half and then the other?
Well, go ahead, Ed, and then I'll speak afterwards.
Yeah, after the 22 valuation, the 2022 valuation, when we were still at 7.55% assumption, our recommendation to the board was to go to 22.40%. And then we did the experience study and the board lowered the assumed investment assumption to 7%. And so then after that, we did the 23 valuation, and our recommendation was to go to 27.4%, phased in over a 5-year period. But the board adopted the same recommendation I had from the previous year to go to 22.4, similar to what Dr. McCoy said. Did I get that?
Yeah, no, that basically covers it, and that's essentially what I was gonna say. I was just gonna point out that when we went into last session with the 22.4 phased-in recommendation being the recommendation, the board had also approved the change in assumed rate of return, and the report had been provided that showed it being 27 approximately, and that's basically what he was saying. And then I think, you know, some of this next part, we all may describe somewhat differently, but as Dr. McCoy was alluding to, I think part of it was the board had already acted on the 22.4. We were phasing it in over 3 years. Perhaps there's no need to necessarily take the formal action until you go through the 3 years and see what happened and see where you stand.
On that single sheet that we sent over to the legislature, on the bottom down there, it did have the other recommendation of going all the way up to the next 5% on there. And that actually created a little confusion in that we were hearing that some legislators were telling everybody that we were going to that, which that was not what the board had voted on. So, anyway, I think, Ed,
And then
your memory was much clearer.
Yeah. And then, is it okay if I?
Well, let me just
share
say this, let me ask, I guess, rather, the next thing I was planning on talking about was changes in the funding policy. Well, you may want to defer action on that too, which I certainly can understand. Which would you prefer? We have some information here from Ed. I'm not sure exactly what Dr. McCoy is wanting to hear. To give you a little bit of a preview, there are a lot of slides anticipated for this afternoon after lunch associated with Tier 5 and related matters. The morning session was going to be covering some of the stuff from last month's presentations. We didn't cover as much due to time constraints, and maybe some information on contribution rate risk and so forth. Both of those could take a noticeable amount of time depending on the questions. So is there anything in particular you're wanting to see, or do we just jump to that? I'm looking for guidance there.
There's a reason this meeting's happening this month instead of next month.
Sure, sure,
This is one of these reasons. This is one of the reasons why.
sure.
So I would say, why don't we do Ed's part? Let's say decision-making type of recommendations for the board till kind of at the end, and then we'll maybe do those in the afternoon instead of this, if that.
No,
works okay.
that sounds
Or we'll
good.
just push on and because there may not be a vote today at all,
Yeah, sure.
understandably, but then I would say in December, there would need to be a vote at least, but preferably now to adopt some of these things, potentially, depending on what information the board has and its comfort level.
That sounds good to me. One quick little follow-up. Do you, not to vote, but would you like me to go through the funding policy changes or just wait and do that later?
Board have a preference on that? Why don't we just wait till later,
Sounds good.
whenever the hard part starts?
Yeah, got you. All right.
Okay. So I just went through the 22 val and the 23 val recommendations, just to remind you all, this is what our recommendation was when I was here last month, was that CABMAC recommends that the board and legislature consider a funding change to either pay the full ADEC of 25.92 or continue a phased-in approach of 5 consecutive years to 27.9%. So I know we're going to discuss that in a little bit, but just wanted to, while that was fresh in everybody's mind, that was our recommendation. One of the things that we didn't get a chance to get to due to the length of the October administrative committee meeting was to kind of talk about the risk assessments, and it's something that the actuarial profession has really driven home to us is to be able to provide the assessments of risk for different measures on each of your pension plans across the country. So, and especially with a fixed contribution rate or a statutory contribution arrangement like Mississippi PERS has and other states have that kind of arrangement, risk is very important to review on an annual basis. So, these are types of, and this is actual standards of practice 51. There are about 100 of these that pertain to our profession. But 51 talks about risk, and these are just some of the relevant risks that are in place for public sector plans. There's a lot of other risks that you can look at for defined contribution and that kind of stuff. But for defined benefit public sector pension plans, we want to look at investment risk, longevity risk, talking about mortality is, do we see anticipation of improved mortality going forward, or do we see another, event like the pandemic we just experienced? So we want to look at mortality experience as well. There's a payroll risk obviously involved in what is payroll going to grow, and Mr. Higgins talked about that. We're funding basically assuming that our payroll is going to grow in the future. Well, that has a big impact. If the demographics of the state don't increase, that means our payroll doesn't increase. So we'll look at that. And then obviously there's some contribution risk that goes on as well. So as far as investment risk, it's the most common thing to look at when we're talking about risk because it's the biggest driver for the numbers. So the top part of this, I always go through this, and I've shaded out the other two systems. I'm typically here providing the results of those. Those results have not been completed as of yet, but we'll look back in December to go through the results with you for those two plans. But again, the top part of this table just looks at a single year event, just to show you the volatility that we can see in these projections. We're running 30-year projections out for you and looking at what the funded ratio is basically in 23 years from now, as that's our objective. So on our baseline, this is all using the current legislative statutory rates of going up to the 19.9% of payroll. So these assumptions assume all of that because that's kind of in law right now. So the 7% baseline says we're at 53.7%, and that's kind of what I presented last month. But you can see if 2025 fiscal year ends with a 1% return, we could be looking at that funded ratio dropping 11% down to 42.7%. On the inverse, if we get a great return like we did this past year, 13%, we could be looking at 64, about 11% higher. So that's just 1 year's investment return. So there is a volatility that occurs. So it's coming up with a recommendation of what to contribute for that long term is hard, is difficult, and that's why we fluctuate from year to year on our recommendations, and that's why that's why we need to show this risk to you all because it is. But what my goal here is, you'll know what the return is looking like come April-ish, May-ish, go back to these charts because you'll kind of get a sense of where I'm going to be at the next valuation, because that's kind of what we're doing here. If we were to simulate some other returns like a -5% or even a -15% like we saw in 2008, the projected funded ratio could be much further worse than where we are now. So just something to consider. Hopefully, we're more on the positive 13% range and so forth. But just to have that in your back pocket of that risk. We also simulate over the next 10 years, what if you average 6%, 7%, 8%? Where would the projected funding ratio be? Obviously, if we project 6-7%, and these are stochastic models where they're not just 7% for every year. They fluctuate, but they average 7%. Well, we're going to be right around that 53.7, and we are. If we average 6%, we're at 39.3, and if we average 8%, we're at 73.5% funded. Now, again, this assumes no other changes to the contribution levels coming in. So if we take a look at demographic risk, so this is, we have built into our modeler where we can increase population or decrease active membership. Because that's so important, because we're getting those dollars into the plan on a statutory basis based on our payroll of what active membership is going to look like. We know who the retireds are. We know who the retirees will be kind of in the next 20 years, but the new entrants that come into this plan are real important in helping fund this plan. So if we have a drop of 0.5% each year, we could see this, our projected funded ratios going down about 5%. And so that number is, if we dropped 0.5%, is about getting down to about the $125,000 member range over a 30-year period, if we drop precipitously over the next 30 years. So what we've built is, okay, well, there's been concern of that if we're raising these contribution levels, that there's a concern that agencies could, certainly lower and try to do more with less members and less people. So we want to look at this risk and dig down a little bit deeper to say, okay, well, what if there is a drop to 125,000 active members? If it's gradual, what is the impact on basically I would come back and kind of recommend to the board as a contribution going forward. Just to get back to the 53.7% funded ratio in 2047, if it was a gradual increase, I'd be asking for 20.98% phased in versus, what's coming in now is 19.9. So about a little over 1%. If we want to get back to green status, and that's my goal and my role as your actuary to kind of guide you back to green status, we'd be asking instead of 27.9%, but 28.9. Again, another 1% above our recommendations. So that's not a big deal, all right? That's a much smaller deal. But what if this drop in active membership happens real quick? Right, and we're not saying that would, but again, looking at the risk aspects of it, what if there's an immediate decrease to 125,000 active members? Well, we're dropping payroll significantly right away. So we're going to need a higher contribution rate needed into that fund. And just to get back to 53.7%, we would need 23.34% of compensation. And to get back to green status, I'd kind of be here asking you to phase in up to almost 32% of pay versus the 27.9. So over almost a 4% increase right off the bat, if this was an immediate decrease. Again, these are all what-if scenarios, just to kind of give you an idea of the risk that goes in to funding these plans. If we look at assumption risk, there's, obviously we've decreased the discount rate or the investment rate of return now over the last decade from 8% to 7%, like most public sector pension plans across the country. It's kind of leveled off over the last 3 years. The average return is still 7%. The median is, the median is 7%. The average is 6.9%. So there's some plans that public sector plans across the country have gone down to 6.25%. I know Indiana uses 6.25% as their investment rate of return assumption. So, what if the board and we come in the next experience study and Callan comes in and says, 7%, it's not looking good that we can get that on a 50th percentile. What if we need to lower that? So again, number two is to lower that assumption to 6.75%. Again, we're not getting as much investment earnings. Contributions are staying level, benefit payments are staying levels. The whole C plus I equals B plus E, our funding is worse off. So we're about 7.5% lower on our funded percentage there. And then if we lower inflation on top of that, and I know inflation was coming down, and it actually, if you read the reports, it actually came back up this past month by 0.1%. So, maybe we're leveling back off at 2.5%. But again, if that was to get worse as well, we would need we'll lose another 1% in our funded ratio. As far as contribution risk, this just looks at 1% increase in our FCR versus a 1% decrease, and it's about 5% in our projected funded ratio either way. So that was kind of the continuation of the longest administrative committee meeting last month, right? So that was just a kind of a continuation, just to give you an idea of the risk that goes into funding this pension plan. We even have animation.
Well, as you're gathering your thoughts or potential questions, the one part I will emphasize that may be a new part to that slide deck is the part about discussing more on demographic risk and contribution rate risk. Of course, both of them very legitimate concerns and risks, but that's what's been brought up at times about when you hear things about if the rate continues to go up, what happens if those paying the rate begin to outsource more services or more functions, and so the population goes down, potentially the payroll goes down, or the contribution so high that there's the risk in paying it. Both of which, especially the contribution rate risk, that is something that is recognized, I guess, by the actuarial community and the various actuarial standards of practice as reflected here. But based on some conversation last time and some requests from board members and others, and Chairman Breland, this is what you were referring to earlier, and so I'll just highlight that. But other than that, I defer to the board.
And I have the modeler available if anybody would like to see any other risk scenarios or any other funding scenarios. Be happy to bring that up if that's the pleasure of the board.
And foreshadowing ahead to that, as far as what was of course, we defer to the board and however y'all would want to do it, but that, certainly the modeling capability being available, and then also many slides going over. I needed to give a Tier 5 update and then several slides from Tier 5. We could do that now, or we could go back to the other items, whichever you prefer.
Well, for me, decision-making, as I came into the meeting today, I was looking at one decision is, and Ed help me here, one decision is how do we take care of the current plan as it is? And everything that's in here today is taking care of the plan as is, correct? And we're trying to, as a board, we're trying to manage what we owe retirees, what we owe the active employees, and we're trying to get that funding to 100%. Okay? Then a second decision is, what do we do? Do we even need a new tier? And what is that new tier for? And I think we need to really decide hard what that is. So what we're dealing with right now, as I see it, is this funding, what we're doing right now with the legislation that has just been passed. So that's kind of the way, in my mind, I've separated what we need to do. However, if we decide to do another tier, that will have some impact on the numbers that we currently are looking at right here. Will it, Ed, or will it not?
No.
Okay, it won't have any effect on these numbers.
No, because the new tier is for, we're looking for more funding either way, right? Even if you have a new tier or you don't have a new tier, right? So we wouldn't, our recommendation is as of the plan, as of today.
Yeah.
That's my role as your actuary at CABMAC is to tell you, as of today, as of the folks, the members in your system today, that we are recommending the board either go to the full ADEC or do this phased-in approach, right? So this doesn't really change. The new tier is for funding for the next generation, right? It's to help the plan potentially limit the increases going forward over the next 10 to 15 years. It certainly does that by introducing a new tier. It helps. Maybe I'm not here every year asking for an increase in the contribution requirement if depending on a new tier approach.
Does the new tier, when you put that in on the 50-year projection, does that change?
Yeah, it does. Yes, it does.
Well, that's what I'm saying.
But
It
this
will
is-
change some of these numbers.
It will change it, but.
In the
but
future.
In the future, after 2047, really. It affects it, different, structures do change, and we'll get into the graphs of all of that.
And you really can't tell until you know how many people wind up in how quickly the new tier populates and
Yeah.
how quickly, because 4 populated quicker than we anticipated.
Yeah.
5 may or may not. So that's a lot of speculation.
Yeah, it's
Well,
hard
A lot
to,
of
it's
projection
hard.
down the road
it's-
to even know. And
It's certainly hard to predict, but the first and foremost is, whether there's a new tier in there, these are the amounts that is gonna be needed to fund PERS.
for us to
Very
get to
close
the
to these
legislature that,
numbers.
hey, this is what it's going to take to get to 100%. Now, again, their determination of whether they want to get to where they are, where we are, they will go to 80 or 75 or whatever, still is their determination at that
That's right.
point.
Right.
But ours at this point, if we want to get to 100, is whether it's phased in or whether it's not.
Right.
This is what this is. The three folk, all three of you have said this is where we need to
Right,
be.
and this is our projection results using the phased-in scenario of the 27.9 is the funded ratio in 2047 would be 93%. And if we were to continue a few more years, it would be 100% within the 30-year period. So this I would be very happy with.
Well, and I'll quickly add this too. I think that should a tier 5 pass in the future, then over the upcoming few years, then the calculation of these various rates and ADEX and so forth could change, but I don't think that change, I know it doesn't change where we are today or as the plan is today. And I think under any scenario, additional funding is needed.
But if you don't do a new tier 5 and we continue on the path we're going with a tier 4, you keep adding people to it because the government will keep hiring people probably. This becomes far more expensive. So then, because you're going to have the 3% compounded interest, plus because a new tier might not have the compounded interest, might have 3%, but not going to have the compounded interest. So to eliminate you coming every time, which I love seeing you, but having to ask for money every time
I don't like
does get old.
Right.
If you don't start making some correction to the current process, it's just going to get more and more expensive. And you're going to get up to, I saw 31% a minute ago. Might as well just shoot us all the way up to, like I said 2 years ago, 100%. Let's just be done with it.
Yeah, it's, believe me, I love coming. This is my favorite board to come see.
Say that to
every
every board,
month.
right?
No, it really is. No, the interaction with this board is great. But, yeah, and we'll talk about tier 5, but really what it does is it helps, depending on, what the structure is. You can design a new tier to help kind of maintain the sustainability of the pension plan long-term and control that cash flow. That's huge by controlling that cash flow, and potentially lowering those future cost of living adjustments for new members who were not even hired yet.
Because they don't exist yet. But like the current tier, I mean, this is just getting too expensive. I mean, it's just gonna continue to get more expensive and unwieldy and something we'll have to give. I mean, whether it's increase of taxes or increase somewhere along the line, I mean, you have to have a revenue source. And the more you add to it, the more revenue source that's gonna take. So it's better to go ahead and solve that problem sooner rather than later. I mean, I think, the amount of money we're going to have to pay out is getting closer to $1 billion, that the Treasury and PERS has to pay out every year to beneficiaries, which is great. They deserve it, and that's fantastic. But that number keeps growing. It's not shrinking.
Well, I do think one of the advantages, as we've said before, to a new Tier 5 is the potential to relieve some pressure on the continuing need to grow the employer contribution rate.
Pressure, now that's the kind of discussion I'm really willing to have on the tier. You express your view of why we need it, what we need it for, and what it's doing. With that clarity, I can have a discussion on it of how we need to go there. But now, again, in my poor little old simple mind, I'm looking at this right now. What have we got to do to take care of this? Let's decide that, and then let's go to the tier discussion, because I have strong feelings about the tier. But we've got to do this first and foremost and come up with a recommendation that we're going to send to the legislature that we feel comfortable with, that we can tell all of our members why we have done what we have done, and share that with all the members of the legislature. On our recommendation, this is what we do. Now, the thing that we don't have, we don't know the diversionary tactics that the legislature can affect. We don't know additional funds that they can add to it and reduce the phase in here for the next few. I don't know that. So I've only got this right here. We can show them some numbers. We can show them if we continue to put 110 million in, how it will affect it. We know what it is, and we can show them those numbers. But I think I'm willing to get to pretty quickly on voting on this first portion of this.
Heard everything but a motion to recommend to the legislature
Without
consider
saying
a
the
funding
words.
change
You
to
got
either pay the
close.
full ADEC.
I will make that
or
motion.
stop
I'll
right
make the motion.
All right, what are you actually motioning for now?
That by whether phased in or, they're not gonna do it. I don't know if they're gonna have any, I would not sense a 25, 92 contribution rate next year, but a phase in of the 25.92 or 27.9% contribution rate
So would that,
over a period of time.
perhaps,
Just for
A
clarity,
recommendation that the 25.92 rate is the rate that is necessary to fund the plan at 100%. That if, our recommendation would be, I guess my motion would be to phase in a rate increase until we reach the point of
being 100%.
Of being 100% funded.
Funded target.
And that's the target, then they determine what percentage or what, if anything, they want to do with that.
would you possibly be willing for the motion to sound something like, move that we recommend the actuarially determined contribution of 25.92% or an additional amount to phase in the same results?
Yes.
Something,
Yeah, that, based on the 3 actuarial reports that we have received.
Yeah, and just for clarity, why is the 27.9% higher than the 25.92? Because of the phase-in approach, we're gonna have some built-up losses. That's why I'm asking for more on a phased-in approach above the ADEC rate now. So that's just so you know, they will, the numbers in this table are pretty much the same with either approach. So
With the terminology that you use, yes,
that was well said. Yeah.
That was well phrased. So yes, I'll make that motion.
Did you get that?
And I'll just restate that then. No, I'll restate it, Shelley, is to, board to recommend, sorry.
Commissioner Graham wanted to ask a question. May as well get some questions out of the way before we get in the
Well,
middle of all the motion.
I think you wanted
and
clarity of what the
if
motion
that's-
was.
I'm kind of out of order. I know there's been a motion made. Did you do any type of, so I think the last board action was to go to 22.4, if I'm still reading my notes correctly, and the legislature chose not to take that approach when they changed the law, and I think they went up 0.5, is that correct, instead of the 2? So there's a 1.5 difference in that. Did you do anything to calculate what the 22.4 would be, given the fact the legislature didn't do what we had recommended? In other words, the board had said, we're going to 22.4, we're going to reevaluate. At that point, legislature said, we're not going to go that far. We went to 0.5. Where would that put our 22.4, if that's what the board was wanting to do?
As far as funding
Where-
ratio.
Where would
funding
it
wise?
wouldn't be 22, would we still be trying to go to 22.4? I mean, I don't, if we were just going to stick with what we did before, or would it be 22? So I noticed you went to 27.9 instead of 27.4. Some of that's because they only went up 0.5, right? And so that changed that number by a slight amount. Does that change our 22.4 number by a slight amount, or is it a larger increase, is what my question is. I'm horrible at asking questions, so I'm sorry.
I got your question. I think, our CABMAC's recommendation was to the 27.4, and now it's 27.9. I've not run a scenario with the 22.4 on the 2024 results, so.
So in other words, the board, at least at the time it voted, was comfortable taking it to 22.4, reevaluating it with the understanding that we would start the first 2% last year. I guess it was really July 1st of this year, I guess. And so that number would have changed a little bit, at least from the board's perspective, because the legislature chose to only go up 0.5. Is my
There is a
very bad way of
chart.
asking that.
There is a chart on page 34 of your packet that shows the 17.9 this year and then up to the 19.9 in 2029. And the recommendation that we're considering now would change that particular chart. Does this give you any insight or any help? That page 34. Apologize, Ed. You probably had that right on top of your head. What page that was?
While he's finding that, I'll just say this too, to some of the, I think it's relevant to some of the things that were stated, asked or implied is, I think the longer we wait, or the longer the state waits, or the longer it goes each year, typically the cost is gonna go up gradually.
I agree with that, but we had that discussion last year.
Sure.
When the board, and it really was longer than last year because the
Yeah.
initial was to go up right away. The board backed off of that and decided to do a phased-in approach and then reevaluate. And so that, we had that discussion. I get it. I mean, the time value of money puts you further behind depending on how your investment results are and
Sure.
everything else. But I get it, but we had that discussion back.
When we first had the lump sum, we didn't have the 27, we had not lowered the 7 at that point.
Yeah,
We did
and that's why I
lump
asked the
sum.
question.
And then when we came back and did to agree to phase in the interim between the whole 5% and the phase in, we also dropped the expected rate of return. So we had them both at the same time.
Right, and that's why I asked that question. I couldn't remember the exact timing on when we first chose to do that.
So actually, it goes back before that a little bit, but anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, so here is the current Val results, projection results that I presented last month with the 0.5% increase that the legislature, altered the PERS board adopted. If it went up to the 22.4%, that funded ratio would be 67%, projected funded ratio. So still in the red.
That was phased in.
That would be phased, if the PERS recommendation was still in place.
Okay.
That would be 67%.
Okay.
So still in the red. So again, I still would have been recommending the 27.9%.
Which is why you recommended the 27.4 as well, I believe.
Yeah, that's right.
It's just changed a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah, it all tracks. It's all very similar, just gradual changes.
The, for me, Bill, you know, I am comfortable going to that, you know, 5.92, and if we phase it into the 27.9, I'm comfortable with that phasing in, and because that's what we know out there is the contribution is. I would, you know, I would also want to say, or a combination of this plus, a long-term plan, a 5-year plan of cash infusion of X number of dollars per year, so that we can calculate it and stabilize for 5 years before we look at it again. Now, we may look at it and it may show us it's going up a little bit, but the board can decide whether we want to recommend or stay with what we have. So, you know, this is all the numbers that I have. I don't have any more. So, you know, I would be to stabilize a 5-year plan of us getting there. And if all the assumptions are met, we're going to be at 93% funded. If all the assumptions are met. Now, I know that that's a huge thing, but that's what we have. And,
Right.
and our goal, our funding goal is 100%.
Did you say earlier, we're really in the business of just recommending the ADEC and then the legislature is in the business of determining the how?
That is correct, absolutely. With the law change, the sole implementation is on the legislative
So
side.
our motion should really be limited to our recommendation of the ADEC, and then the legislature determines lump sum, cash infusion, phased in, not phased in.
Or
None-
nothing.
Or, yeah,
Or
or
nothing.
nothing. So none of that needs to be in our motion.
Well, I agree. I would recommend the ADEC. I certainly support the part about, or the equivalent phase in, but I see the point that you're talking about these, about the cash infusion. The implementation, the supplement, the how to fund it is on their side.
Yeah.
But since that was a little different than that motion, we'll have to iron out the motion, I guess, before you vote.
Should we not be prepared as a board if they say, okay, we've got your recommendation. Do you have any recommendations, board, of how we can get there?
Yes, then we
Now-
can answer.
Now we've talked about some ways to get there. You can phase it in over this amount, or you can add cash to it, or we would have some sort of those recommendations.
I think we'd be ready with the options like we were last time.
Oh, sure. Well, and even if, let's say hypothetically, to your point, if it was just recommending the ADEC, then the cover letter could easily explain how this actuarial had information about phasing it in, however we do it. Plus, they have the reports, but I just defer to
And I'm not opposed to modifying my motion to recommend the ADEC and because the ADEC also, when we're talking about the ADEC, it shows what the ADEC is if it's phased in.
That's right.
So if we just recommend the ADEC, it's got both numbers there. Yep. On a
I
2-year
liked the
phase.
motion you stated a few minutes ago.
Yeah, all right. And then if it is, but thank you for that. If it goes back to the, now, just recommending the ADEC probably would be the clearest, and then the rest of it they could consider by looking at the materials.
I'm okay with modifying my motion I'll modify my motion to recommend the ADEC as presented by the actuary and the 2 additionals. And that also shows what it does if there was a determination to phase that in.
And what I'm gonna do on that is we would use, you said this, but just to clarify, we'll use the 2592 of CAVMAC.
Right.
As far as a specific percentage.
With the other supplemental information.
Yeah, exactly, supported by the other 2. Don't forget a second. I know. I heard somebody whispering
There might
behind me.
not be one, so.
Yeah. And if you would like me to type something up during lunch, I can do that, whichever you prefer. Even though I think we got it pretty streamlined there.
Is everybody clear on the motion?
No phase-in.
The motion would be to recommend the ADEC as presented. My motion is to recommend the ADEC as presented by the actuary and along with the supplemental backup information from the 2 additional actuaries.
Sounds good to me, and that's gonna be 2592.
But now are you open for the continued discussion?
Well,
Let me-
why
let
don't
me-
we go with a second,
Let me second
if
that
there is
first.
one? All right, motion and a second.
I was saying, sorry, I interrupted the first time.
That's okay. Well, it actually worked out because I saw a modification potential in our future anyway. So now we have a motion and a second. Further discussion, questions?
So if whatever we recommend, it's still the liberty of the legislature to do a phase in or however they want to do it. That's still their prerogative.
Or nothing, or continue the path that we're on, that
I'm
is.
satisfied with that.
The discussion that we've had is basically how to get to the ADEC. You know, that's what the discussion that we've had here. We are validating with this motion the ADEC, and that's what they say it's gonna take for us to get there. So all this other, we can provide, not as a recommendation, but the board had discussions in a supplemental letter or whatever. We've had discussions of how to get there, and we have discussed these possible ways to get to this. You know, and I don't know that we have to, make that in the form of a motion, because we get that right from the minutes of this discussion that is had, so. But again, that's in the legislature's hands how to fund it, because that's what they wanted last year, and now they have it.
For that to come about, we're gonna be right back where we were last year, of them hearing from the county officials that we just cannot pay that additional amount. But we could swallow it if it's phased in. Otherwise, we will be right here in the same complaint we heard last year from cities and counties and school systems.
Again, at this point though, that's not
our
us.
problem.
That's not us.
up to them.
That's legislature's issue at that point, at this time, because we don't have the authority to
So we
make.
want to make the legislature be the bad guy.
Yeah.
Is that what we're trying to
Well,
do?
now, Commissioner, they already were, if you want to call it the bad guys, but,
If
I don't know how to describe it that way.
You gotta come see me. Go to the slide where you have the three recommendations. Would you go to the slide where you have those, other than this one that we're looking at right now?
I'm not sure. Was
This has the, it's in the report.
Yeah.
I don't have a slide for that. I have it in the report. But yeah, my three recommendations in the report were the ADEC, this scenario here,
Fully funding
going
it.
to the 27.9, phasing into the 27.9. And then I did have another scenario in the report that had $110 million
Yeah.
made to the lump sum like they did this past year.
In reading that report and information to the board, that's
Yeah.
what I was discussing, was what he had shared with us. And that can be shared with the legislature, that we had a report from our actuary as to how to get there.
Right, and all three got you basically to the same
And
point.
they get to the same place, and we can certainly share that part of the report, because that's all public stuff.
Sure. And speaking of that, it's all, of course, already been shared and is in the process of being shared. And more specifically, should this motion pass, which is to recommend the ADEC as presented by the actuary, which is 25.92, supported by the other two actuary reports. Should that pass, I'm going to send it with the two other actuary reports in accordance with the new law. And of course, I'll put in CAVMAX as well. So that would actually be relaying exactly what you said.
I think we need to point out what page those
Oh,
things
sure,
are on. I
yeah.
mean, if I were a legislator, I wouldn't be sitting down to read all this information. I would want to know the page number I need to go to and look at. Cause they got reams of stuff. So, I'm in favor of lunch.
Further,
You wanna go first?
lunch votes next, and that one will be easy. A slam dunk, really. So, any other questions, comments, discussion? All right, if not, those in favor of the motion in a second, say aye. Any opposed? Opposed. Opposed? You good, Shelley?
Got it.
Okay. Motion carries. Then, Do we have a motion to break for lunch?
Yeah, it'd be fine.
I'll second
It's
that.
supposed to be easy.
I know, they're ready.
Okay, motion to
Wow, we're having
second.
too much fun.
We'll take a reset. Don't worry, we'll be back.
Wait, what time you wanna come back at 1 or?
good to go? All right, Ray?
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. The next item is to go through proposed changes to the PERS funding policy. And I'll go through them in detail and walk through basically each section, but just broadly speaking, what this does, for all intents and purposes, it is being proposed to be revised to reflect what you just done, to reflect moving toward the ADEC, the actuarially determined contribution, an ADEC policy, and to reflect changes, recent changes in state law, similar with the last action prior to the lunch recess. This has been put together certainly with staff, but the majority of the suggested edits either come from me or actuary Ed Coble. I apologize for the markup, but I wanted to leave the information and leave it marked up so you could see specifically what the proposed changes are. And so with that, I'm going to just go through page by page. Again, broadly speaking, it's to move to an ADEC policy, reflect changes in state law. And to give an example of what I mean by that, as you've discussed over the last few meetings and months, previously the board implemented the employer rate, whereas now the board is recommending a rate and the legislature will implement it. So that explains in summary form a lot of the changes. On that note, before I walk through it, you could make the case or raise the question, do we still need these metrics in here? And what I tried to do is accomplish what I previously stated, but be as consistent as we could otherwise. And so I left two of them in this proposal in here for information or reporting purposes. As you'll see when I get to the third one, we'll talk a little more about that. But with that, I'm only going to go over the ones, the changes. If this is agreeable, I'll only go over the ones that are more substantive in nature. And again, most of those edits come from me or certainly worked in concert with our actuary. So on page one toward the top, in some of the blue changes there, you'll see proposed, all of these of course are proposals subject to your approval, but suggestions to remove some of the language there about based on the metrics and assumptions. And it simply says the employer contribution rate recommended by the board for PERS will be based on the actuarial determined contribution, ADC, as reflected by the annual valuation report using the assumptions and methods outlined in this policy. And that's essentially what just happened in the last action. Of course, this proposes to put it in the policy, but that's basically what was just done. If you move down a little bit to the middle of the next section under funding goals and objectives, you'll see a proposed deletion to take out the line that talked about contribution rate stability as a percentage of payroll, fixed contribution rate. That's deleted and replaced with develop a pattern of contribution rates expressed as a percentage of employer payroll and measured by valuations prepared in accordance with applicable state laws and the principles of practice prescribed by the Actuarial Standards Board. If you keep flipping to move to page 2 up toward the top, under metrics, there's a deletion there. Again, this talks about using the metrics as to helping advise the board on whether or not an increase or a decrease is needed in the employer contribution rate. Theoretically, if you move to an ADEC policy, you wouldn't need that, and that's why that's being adjusted. Same thing, if you go to the metric, you see a slight revision under the definition of the red. I just proposed changing it to plan fails metric, because it went on to say, used to say in PERS must consider contribution increases, but if you're moving to an ADEC, that wouldn't really be the case. Just under that, there's some deletion and adjustments recommended. Again, moving from, before it was the signal light method and the metrics, and if any one metric was in the red status, then the actuary was to recommend to the board contributions to get all metrics back in the green status, so that's being revised under this concept. We move to page 3. You see both of the metrics, slight revision in that definition, but the funded ratio metric and the cash flow metric is left in there. Some minor changes on the cash flow, but that's just wordsmithing a little bit. At the bottom of page 3, in this version, is proposed to delete the ADC ratio metric. Theoretically, if you're going to the ADEC and going to an ADEC policy, you wouldn't necessarily need that. Of course, I could understand where there may be some discussion amongst the board and wanting to leave that, or others, which is certainly fine, but that was the rationale in deleting that in this suggestion. And then going through the remainder of page 4 and page 5, those seem to be just formatting type things, which will be cleaned up once we finalize the document, should you approve. If you go over to page 6, here's another substantive change. We're up under the actuarial audit. I propose putting a new section that entitled Additional Independent Actuarial Assessments. And when the board recommends an increase to the employer contribution rate, the recommendation will be accompanied by at least 2 independent actuarial assessments in accordance with state law. Future annual valuations and separate periodic actuarial audits may suffice for this purpose. So I'm just adding that in there in concert or in compliance, if you will, with 3231. Now, what I mean by this last sentence of future annual valuations and separate audits may suffice for this purpose, what I'm getting at is we may find in the future, and it could be a few years, but we may determine in the future that if coordinated right, maybe in this case, the regular actuarial report from CAVMAC and the customary actuarial audit, seem to be going in and out on the microphone a little bit. In the periodic audit, those are 2 separate assessments. So that's what I'm alluding to there, that maybe depending on the timing and how things work out, that would be 2 independent actuarial assessments that may suffice. And then just under that, some minor changes there that basically says we'll do it while we're doing these regular reports, the evaluation and the experience study. And I believe those are all the substantive changes. And at the proper time, would like to ask for your approval of the recommended changes to the funding policy. Would request action on that today, but I don't think it's quite as instrumental as the last vote. I think it was important to go ahead and confirm the position of the board on what to recommend funding-wise. But should you want additional time, I think we could always do this at a December meeting. But if you're comfortable with it, would request approval of it today. And like I said, even though there are a lot of changes, for the most part, it's all related back to the same thing, which is the philosophy of moving to an ADEC policy and reflecting the changes in state law where it's no longer the board implementing it, it's just recommending. So
I would request that we delay voting on this because when I was looking at this, trying to review this, all these corrections were not on there. I just got the new copy and it didn't show where the corrections had been made. And I would just prefer us to delay this to the next meeting for questions, just to give some time to look at that. Because I always have to look up the definition of ADEC versus ADC and compare them. Stuff like that, so.
Ray, is there any time sensitive to this?
I don't think so, and we'll think it through as we go here, and I'd welcome the actuaries or if anybody, DeVette or anybody else on staff has any concerns, but I don't think so. But I certainly understand that, and, typically for something voted, we give plenty of time in advance, so I, felt like and you coming in was gonna say that if there's any concerns, there's no problem there. Just for background and information on what Dr. McCoy's talking about, I think that had to do with probably his screen or equipment. So if you go out in the portal, you should be able to see it. But if you have any trouble, let me know. Because I had the same thing happen to me on my phone. Sometimes the track changes don't show. So you should have it now in hard copy, and it should be out there electronically. But I don't think so. No, sir. I don't think there's any concerns on the funding policy.
Well, with the
You already done the report.
Yeah, with the 2024 report already completed and accepted by the board, then this funding policy will really be for the 2025 evaluation and how we have to, show our funding.
Anybody see anything that stands out that they want to question or may want some more information before
Well,
December potential?
while we are eliminating the ADC, that section, and I have not had time to read it carefully. It's just because we've had 4 metrics that we looked at. We eliminate that. Now we only got 3. So it's just a concern of what we have.
Well, quickly on that, it's actually 3, but go down to 2. I can comment further.
I think you eliminate the decision, one of the metrics, you actually are driving it now on recommendation instead of evaluating how it looks versus your percentage of payroll. So
There's gonna be no more FCR. With what the board did prior to lunch, there's gonna be no more calculation of a fixed contribution rate. So the fixed contribution rate will be gone. We'll be calculating an ADEC still like we've always done, but that will be the recommendation of the board to the legislature going forward every year. So it'll be based on the funding policy and the metrics and the actual assumptions, amortization methodology that goes into that. So there's no need to have that ADEC to FCR ratio because there will no longer be an FCR.
The only other thing that when we initially adopted this document was, the extremely definitive words of will and shall, because this was to be a guiding document, not a document that forced us to take action. So that's what I want to make sure that I read, and the wills and shalls are not forced. Doesn't come back to bite us as an administrative policy when the board should vote. So that's my only other concern on that, really.
No concerns here and not, totally understand. I don't
Okay.
think we have any-
Unless there's any other questions or strong feelings otherwise about getting it passed today, which I suspect the last part aren't, then we'll just defer till the December meeting.
No problem, sounds good.
All right, thank you.
I think the next item has to do with some Tier 5 scenarios, and as Ed begins to pull up his slides, give a little bit of an update and intro on that. We did have some follow-up meetings with Senate leadership on potential Tier 5 scenarios. There seems to be the possibility for support and some interest and some support on the hybrid approach. You may remember us going over that some last time, and in follow-up, it seems to be that may end up being like I said, an approach of interest or a preferred approach, or certainly some support from that. So do want to provide that update as well as go over. There were a couple of suggested changes in it that we talked through, and we'll go over them. You'll see them on one of Ed's slides. But basically, just to remind you, that hybrid, and I'm gonna go ahead and include the updates, the slide updates from that, would be hypothetically a 1%, it'd be part DB, part DC. Yeah, the DB part would be a 1% multiplier. And of course, there were a few other changes that you'll see on the slide, but it'd be 8-year vesting. The compensation would be based on there we go. All right, so benefit multiplier on the DB, thank you, Ed, would be 1% for all years. There was some extended retirement eligibility. The final average earnings would be over the highest 8 consecutive years. So you've got 8-year vesting, and then instead of the high 4, it'd be the high 8, the highest 8 consecutive years. No COLAs, no guaranteed COLAs, no PLSO option. And then the member contribution rate would be 9%, but split 4% to the DB and then 5% required to go to the DC portion. I think you can see this on your screens here now. That is a little different. Last time it was the other way around, but in this version it is 4 to the DB, 5% to the DC portion. Automatically enrolled to save more, no employer match on the DC side, and then vesting would be immediate vesting on the DC portion. So that's just an update on the hybrid that you can already see some of it here, and he'll go over it in more detail later. Also in this package is to follow up on some Tier 5 scenarios mentioned or requested in the last board meeting or by a few board members, different scenarios, like, for example, what does it look like if we have the 3% simple COLA instead of compounded? What is it if it's like a 2.5% COLA or a 1.5%? Some of those scenarios have been calculated as well. And Ed, I think if you're ready, you can go through the new ones.
Okay. So we touched on this a little bit in October. We're just going to go through 4 different slides where we're looking at, and kind of went through one of them already, but.
And go ahead further, yeah.
Yeah. But these slides just kind of illustrate the plan features for each of these new Tier 5 designs. Again, just Tier 5 for any future employees, active employees into the PERS. So this is, this first option is a pure defined benefit plan with lower cost of living adjustments, and there's a scenario where there's none, so it is lower, and lower employee contributions. So this is, we looked at this last month. This is very similar to this, to what we had last month, where we everything is basically the same as Tier 4, vesting, retirement, average compensation, multiplier, All of that is the same as tier 4. The only difference is the cost of living adjustment. We have two sub scenarios off of this, is that no COLA is guaranteed, or only 1% of a cost of living adjustment is guaranteed. And because this is a smaller, I guess, future benefit for members, we did look at lowering the contribution rate for this group from 9% to 7%, since they're not getting those guaranteed 3% COLAs. The second option takes that same scenario, but it uses current employee.
Can I ask a question on
course.
the one before?
Sure.
Why didn't you guarantee 2 or guarantee 3?
Well, 3 would be the same, then we'd just be at tier 4.
Well, there's no compounding, so that would be a difference.
I'm sorry, this is the 1% guaranteed is compounding, yes,
Okay,
for this
here
scenario.
It is
Yes, it is,
compounding.
yeah,
Okay.
sorry. Yeah, we didn't look at, we looked at 2% and 3% on the next slide.
Okay.
So because this plan, this option 2 looks at, again, everything the same as tier 4, except now we're offering compounding guaranteed COLAs of, again, 4 different scenarios of 1.5%, 2%, 2.5% of compounding, and then also a 3% simple COLA, which is a little bit slight difference if you're not compounding that cost of living adjustment. So for this, where the option is to keep the member contribution rate at 9%. So they would still get less of a benefit, the members, but they would still pay the same amount into PERS, but they would get a smaller cost of living adjustment in their future once they retired. So those are the two pure DB plans that we looked at that were very, very similar to the current tier 4. And I know that was a big issue with the PERS board earlier this year when we discussed this. The third option is this, it's again another pure DB plan, but it's got a reduced structure. So this has, again, this eligibility and average compensation is the same, but the multiplier is reduced from basically 2% of pay, a final average pay times service, to 1.5%. So it's cut down by 25%. The benefit is cut down by 25% right there. And then the cost of living adjustment would be guaranteed at 2%, and that should be 2% compounding. So again, lower multiplier, lower COLA going forward, we could reduce the member contribution down to 7%. And this multiplier, the 1.5%, if you take statewide systems across the country who are also in Social Security, the 1.5% multiplier is more in line, and the 2% COLA are more in line with plans that are in Social Security as well. Just an average of all those statewide plans that participate. Not all statewide plans participate in Social Security and have a DB plan. So we kind of want to look apples to apples there and look at that. So the 1.5%, this is all from the NASRA database that I know you've seen from Keith Brainerd. If you go to the conference, he provides all this stuff. And then option 4 was kind of what Mr. Higgins just went through, is the hybrid, which has a portion of the DB and a portable DC portion. So as we did last month, board members and staff wanted me to look at, well, what are typical benefits going to be coming out of each of these tiers, out of each of these tier designs. So the current PERS plan, well, we have pay at retirement of $60,000 and a member who worked 30 years. The estimated final average earnings is almost $58,000. Annual benefit would be $34,600. If they're getting a 3% compounding COLA after 10 years, their benefit would be $46,500. $1,500. With Social Security, they'd get another $30,000, $18,000 through Social Security, or 30% of final pay. And that's, again, just an estimate of what Social Security could provide to these members. So, so that's included there. So the replacement ratio at retirement is 87.7%. So really good replacement ratio at the time of retirement, that is. Okay.
Ed?
Yeah, I'm sorry. The Social Security benefit is not included in those dollar amounts. It's included in the last column, but not the dollar amounts. My apologies for.
And when you say the last column, do you mean the replacement percentages,
Yeah.
annual benefit, or both?
The replacement percentages of your final pay of the $60,000.
And so,
So is that 87% in my mind, if an employee were to go to a financial advisor and say,
Yeah.
when you retire, you ought to be aiming for 87.7% of your active pay, is that what they suggest now? Or-
Yeah, most financial advisors want folks to target 75 to 80%. You know, it's all dependent on how you want to live and how you want to spend your money in retirement. If you want to travel, if you want to do other things.
Most of ours want
go-
100%.
go- I would love to get 100% as well.
but 100% is an increase,
Yes.
because FICA's 7.65%,
Yeah,
and this retirement is what percent?
80.
Seven?
What's that?
7% on most of these that are coming is the employee.
Yeah, 7 or 9, sure.
And I know that's net of tax, so it gets complicated.
Yeah.
But that's still a percentage that's not coming to them
Yeah.
now, whereas this would, and your numbers do not really factor that in, is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah,
So
we're only
these are actually understated compared to what these people would be
Because there's
getting.
16.65 coming out now, that's not gonna
Yeah,
be
I
coming
mean,
out.
taxes and that kind of stuff
Sure.
is gonna wash, but yeah, contributions. I've heard anecdotally stories, from board members and staff that said, you know, when they retired, they were getting more in their retirement check than they were in their active salary check. So, you know, I think Mr. Dale was one of the people.
Oh, really?
So,
Good to know.
Probably talking about net take home.
yeah, net
Yeah,
take.
yeah, net take.
Well, it's large pound, it's between the member contribution and then the FICA.
That 16.65%, not looking at state tax.
Right. Yeah, without
Is
tax.
pretty significant, it's not coming out.
So, so then, yeah, some of the other options that we reviewed, and there were obviously some more different scenarios, but I chose a few here just to kind of look at. On the tier 5 that the board approved from last year's legislation model, with either no COLA, a 1% compounding COLA, or a 3% simple cost of living adjustment. You can see the only really difference here is that third column over, or fourth column over, the annual benefit after 10 years. The annual benefit at retirement's the same as it was in the previous sample. Just the annual benefit after 10 years is slightly different depending on getting no COLA, 1% COLA, or 3% simple COLA.
And when you mean no COLA, you mean no guaranteed
No
COLA.
guaranteed COLA.
So there is a COLA, it's just not promised.
It's not promised, yes.
And then with
It would
the
come down to board.
CPI or whatever, right? Have we just ignored doing with the CPI or anything?
Yeah, this has no increases whatsoever. If you retired at 34,600, that's what you'd be getting after 10 years.
Okay.
Could be either, right? I mean, it could be no guaranteed COLA, period.
Right.
Or it could be
You could get up to a certain
not
amount,
precluded, but,
but it'd be up to the board paying like a dividend.
right, it could be not guaranteed,
Yeah.
and then not even an option to have a COLA, no matter
Right.
what, depending on the
The PERS
legislation.
board could give ad hoc cost of living adjustments. It could give 13th check, like just bonus kind
So
of
like if investments are
COLAs
good, we.
that don't compound on each other, but just kind of, yeah.
Of course, all of that's gonna depend on how the legislation could be crafted. I think that's what you were getting at. It could be there's no COLA, or it could be the possibility of a COLA. Just depends on how the legislation is drafted. I think for the purposes of this, you didn't build any.
I didn't build it.
With the 1%, 3% simple COLA options, that's no compounded interest in those, right?
The 1% does have compounding, yes.
How much?
Just 1%.
Just one,
Yeah.
so that's what 1 and 3 mean there.
Yeah. Well, 3% is simple, so that's
Oh,
just.
sorry, I missed the word simple.
3%
Yeah.
simple is whatever 3% of $34,600 is. That dollar amount is added to that benefit every year. That it's so, what's that, about $1,000? Yeah, because it's $10,000 higher, so it's a little bit over $1,000.
After 10 years,
So,
they make
so you can see
$45,000.
the difference between lines 1 and line 4, that's the difference of compounding, is you're getting about an extra $1,500 a year due to the compounding. And then the second to last scenario is that reduced DB multiplier with a 2% compounding COLA. If it doesn't say compounding, that's what it means. If it, yeah. So again, that's a lower benefit at retirement, but does provide for a 2% cost of living adjustment thereafter. And then the hybrid plan is the estimated final average earnings are slightly lower due to the 8-year formula, 8-year final average earnings versus 4-year. So it starts off with a little bit lower of a base there. And then it has the 1% multiplier times service. So you get a benefit of $26,200. And yeah, so there's no COLA with that as well, so.
And your 73% there is factoring in their 130,000, their DC plan. But that 26.2 is just what they're getting from the defined benefit. It doesn't factor in a percentage, whatever they take out of their defined contribution.
I'm sorry, yes, it does, my apologies, yeah, the asterisk there, it includes about $10,000 per year at retirement that the person would accumulate in their DC portion of about $130,000 in their DC portion, putting in, what is it, 5%?
I see.
Yeah, 5% employee contribution and 5% interest.
$16,000 is about what, 30%, 30 years at 1%, it's gonna be about $16,000 plus.
So that benefit is included in the 26,200. So you'd get about 16,000 from the DB plan, $10,000 from your DC portion. And then you'd get no COLAs on those benefits. So you'd be at $26,200. And then you'd be getting potentially another $18,000 from Social Security.
Ed, I might have misunderstood something in the dialogue, but would it be correct to say that the 26,000 is just the DB side of the benefit and not those other things? And then, but in the replacement ratio's got the rest of it?
No, the DB, for the hybrid, the $26,000 does include the $10,000.
Oh, I see now. Never mind. I was looking at the wrong number. I got it.
Because if you think about it, it's 30 years at 1% is 30% of the 54,000, which is about $15,000 to $16,000. And then you add in the 10, and you get the 26,000.
Okay, now, time for me to interrupt for my question. Why are we considering a tier 5, and what is it supposed to accomplish for the system?
I'm sorry, I distracted him. Let me.
Why are we considering a tier 5, and what is it supposed to accomplish for the system?
I should have started with that slide. So we've talked about this is, you know, why a new tier works. It helps, it aids in the sustainability of the pension plan for many years from now, for the next generation.
Okay, let's stop. Why does it help sustain the pension plan?
Because of providing less, and I'll get to that with graphs, but it does provide for, the the benefit payment structure as currently in place is growing exponentially in the future, the way the current tier is. And we've got to be able to limit that somehow because our contributions are having to go way up to enable to keep the cash flow difference in check. So by being able to come up with a new tier that's a little cheaper, we're able to control that benefit payments going forward. Hopefully, we get the same dollars coming into the pension plan, maybe a little bit less due to employee employee member rates being a little bit lower, but we're able to control that cash flow, and we'll show it in graph form coming up. But and then, as Mr. Higgins said earlier, the biggest thing is the potential to provide relief of not having to, for me to come and ask for contribution rate increases every valuation.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think from my standpoint, I would say Dr. McCoy and I have been on the board relatively the same number of years here. I never remember anybody bringing or discussing an employer contribution rate decrease. Every one of them seems like it's supposed to be the last one. It never has been. This has a better chance of doing that than all these other things that have ever been done. That's and without it, we're gonna be doing the same thing instead of 27, 29, now 31, now 34, now 37, now 30. It just comes down to how affordable, which is questionable right now, to me, anyway, the system is. So it makes it, I would say in a word, affordability. Dr. McCoy.
And, I understand that, and I think that, I just wanna now my question is, how many dollars do we need? I mean, all of this numbers here, but how many dollars do we need to impact that?
We'll try to get you there.
Okay.
Okay. Everybody okay with this? I think you had an issue with that last column. So that last column includes the Social Security piece. The two middle pieces do not include the Social Security benefit.
That's what I was getting at.
Sorry.
This number does not have the dollar amount. The right-hand column does. Okay, yeah, that's what, I agree. I agree.
One comment along with Dr. McCoy's remarks. In my capacity of chairman of the legislative committee, I took the liberty to contact some leadership in the areas over there, and I was told by them, they are not going to consider any issue dealing with PERS until they receive some recommendation from our board, which I think we've partially done that in the earlier recommendation. And as regards to Tier 5, that's one of the things they intend to consider, but they would like our rudiments of what we think should be in a Tier 5. So I think the only thing we would accomplish is, here's what we would, you might could consider with a Tier 5.
I would like to have a letter from the leadership saying, would you give us some direction on the Tier 5?
I will ask that question.
Okay. Now,
President Pro Tem.
the other thing that is important to me is all of our employees in the state are underpaid. Okay, they're underpaid. So we need to make sure that the replacement ratio at retirement is what the financial advisors out there are saying is substantial enough for them to retire. Now, here's my other thing. Plus, we need to try to prevent retirement income erosion. And that comes through a guaranteed COLA of some sort. It's just, I mean, I got a $6,000 annuity. when I got it 10 years ago, I could purchase $6,000 worth of stuff. Right now, I purchase $4,200 with that same amount. So the erosion is an important piece of, because the way I see it, our system is for the people that are gonna retire, and we need to try to keep that from eroding if there's any way possible. And that's the reason I wanna get to know how many dollars we need. And which one of these can actually do it or come close to doing that.
Yeah, no, that's a definite, sentiment, having that inflationary protection. I completely understand, and that's what most, many, public sector systems have, is that inflationary protection of some sort of cost of living adjustment. And, I think with these options is by setting, no guaranteed COLA, it does come down to, again, for the next generation of the board, is that can be decided on if there's funding there. If the funding is better, then cost of living adjustments or bonuses could be given to retirees. I'll give a little anecdotal. I can't really say this plan because but they're about to introduce legislation. They haven't provided cost of living adjustments for their new tier. They developed a new tier many years ago, and it had very similar to this hybrid plan, and it didn't provide cost of living adjustments. Well, the funding is better, and there's legislation now to introduce a guaranteed 1% cost of living adjustment to its retirees. And they don't have very many retirees in there because it's a newer tier, but they're, thinking of now. So that's potentially, could be PERS 15 to 20 years from now, for sure. So I just not saying never, just not saying guaranteed right now. So that's the option. So this is what I was kind of referring to, Dr. McCoy, when I was telling you about the current PERS plan with its guaranteed 3% COLAs. The top left graph here shows the projection of the cash flow. And so the whole shaded area are the benefit payments, and they're broken up into three groups. Current inactives, which is the darker blue line, the current actives, which is the orange line, which continues now and then grows. But that teal part of it is the tier 5, is the new hires that haven't even come into PERS yet. And if they come into the current tier 4, we call them tier 5 members, they continue to grow. And that's what I'm saying. It just, you could see the slope of those benefit payments going out into the future, where you're approaching $9 billion of benefit payments going out. Now, contributions do increase, but you can see that spread really, it gets worse. The difference between the top of the shaded area and the top of the black line, doesn't really improve much throughout these 50 years. It actually gets worse there for the majority of those years, but it doesn't get much better over this time. So that's what we've been kind of looking at, is projecting out the current tier 4 folks out the next 50 years, and that's what kind of brought this review of doing a tier 5 into play. So the bottom right is what the board agreed to for the last year, for the last legislative session that wasn't passed, was the pure DB tier 5 that looked like the tier 4, but it limited those guaranteed COLAs in the future. And you can see that gray line almost doesn't flatten out entirely, but the growth of that is not as significant as you see in the top left. So that's where we say that putting in a new tier 5 aids in the sustainability and helps control that cash flow. And that black line is basically the same thing. It catches up it almost catches it by the end of the 50 years, where almost more contributions are coming in than benefit payments going out. This takes that one step further and says, okay, if there's no COLA or a 1% guaranteed COLA, so these are the two plans, the same plan, just one has no COLA and one has 1% guaranteed. And you can see the slope of that gray, the teal part of the graph is bigger in the bottom right chart than it is on the top left. So again, we're talking, you got still a negative cash flow of over almost $1 billion when you get out to that point. It gets better, certainly gets better than the previous 3% compounding COLA, but we still have issues with our cash flow there. I also ran compounding versus simple just to show you. So these are this is going back to the original graph. On the top left, the 3% compounding versus a 3% simple on the bottom right. And there really isn't much difference. It's hard to tell. There is a slight difference. It's slight lower. The simple COLA is just above $8 billion, whereas the top left is over $8.5 billion when you get out there. So there's not much difference there, but it is a little bit, a slight difference. I just wanted to show you the difference between compounding versus simple. We looked at this last month, but the bottom right here is the reduced DB plan, the 1.5% cost of living adjustment with the 2% guaranteed COLAs. And so this helps. This projection of benefit payments, again, for the teal group, I don't know, it looks gray on my screen, but I guess that's teal. That flattens out. The new tier 5 folks coming in, the benefit payments sure do flatten out, and they don't even grow to above $7 billion. And the projection of contributions coming in, the black line, actually catches it at that 50th year. So again, this provides a lower benefit, but a decent enough benefit to members, and it gives that inflationary protection for future members as well. And then the last one is the hybrid option, which again, this is hard. It's hard to look at this because it doesn't include the DC portion of the benefits. This is only the DB, the defined benefit portion of this. So the cash flow is a little bit less, but remember the DC portion is now all employee contribution driven. There's no employer cost because there's no match. So this would be the biggest savings to PERS down the line, and it actually reduces the new tier 5 benefit payments actually starts to drop. The magnitude is growing, but the total benefit payments do start to drop over
And
the
that
50
contribution
years.
line is 4%.
That's right. That's right. So that black line is much lower than it is in other graphs, but it is still above the benefit payment. So we would have positive cash flow at that point once it crossed. Here's your projection of funded ratios. Again, a lot of lines here to review. I've got a lot of different plans here. The first line there, the blue line, is the current PERS tier. And you can see, and I made a note in the second bullet here, is that the current PERS plan will take about 50 years to reach 80% funded. So I know in the modeler and other things you've seen only the next 30 years, but it takes till 2072 before and if current PERS tier was to continue and 19.9% was to be contributed every year going forward after the phase-in, we would only get to 80% funded in 2072. And I'd be 100 years old, so I hope to see that. No. But you could see if going to alternative tier 5 designs would reach that 80% funded ratio in 3 to 11 years earlier. The best one here is the dark blue or purple line. The hybrid plan would reach 80% funded in about 2060 or so. So again, when we talk about what does a tier 5 do, it doesn't, there's, like we said from the get-go, it helps, but it doesn't help all that much over the next 30 years. You can see the next 30 years is 2054, and there's still, we're gonna, with the current funding, we would still, all these tiers would still be right around that 60% funded ratio, between 50 and 60.
None of them really make a turn up until
Yeah,
30
it's
years out.
not until those folks, the current tier 4 folks, members start to have retired and have passed.
Is that line, when you say the funded ratio, and still be close to 60%, 55%, is that the whole system or is that just this tier?
No, it's the whole system.
Okay.
Yeah. So, yeah, in 2054, who's in the plan? There's tier 4s are all retirees. There's a few tier 5 retirees, but they're still all actives. All the actives would be in tier 5. So it's not till then after that the tier 4 folks start dying and the tier 5 are retired, where the real uptick really takes place. So you see the slope. We always look at the slope of the line to see the health of the plan going forward. Again, I ran these out 75 years, but we've only shown 50 years here. But again, look at the slope of the line. The slope of the current PERS tier is a lot less than the slope of some of the other lines, even the line below it in green. That slope of that line, there's gonna cross soon those bottom 2 lines in the next few years after this.
You do know that if we started a tier 5 on July 1 of 2025, that the first tier 5 people would be retiring in about 2040. If you look at our data and people that come in and retire at age 65, the average years of experience is about 15. So we will have people with 15 years retiring. We just need to look at the, I mean, they're not all gonna be 30
Right.
years from now. They're gonna be some in 15.
There's gonna be some in 8 years. There's gonna be some in 8 years who are 62 at 8 who could retire.
But I will ask,
65 and 8.
are those the people
But
that
there's
we're
gonna be
really
small.
trying to take care of? Or are we trying to take care of a 10-year employee or a 15? And I want to take care of them, but are they the ultimate goal? To me, the ultimate goal is that 30-year person
Yep.
who has been here and stays with us is the ultimate person we want to try to take care of. And that a 10 or 15-year one has done some other thing. They've been bouncing around somewhere doing other things, and
They may be already vested in Alabama or Tennessee or somewhere and then come here.
or a federal employee.
Or federal, yeah.
So I'm not as worried, I'm not as concerned about that 10-year, that 15-year person who retires as I am the 30-year career one.
Right, and what we don't show in here is if PERS was to get more funding, these lines hit that 80% mark a lot sooner if we get more funding. And guess what that does? At 2055,
There's money for a COLA. There's money for a COLA at that point.
and that's when your 30-year folks are retiring. And there could potentially, I would say, may have that money to pay COLAs then. Just something to think about. So this is kind of the mirror image of the previous line, but this looks at the unfunded liabilities and where they're going. You can see, and again, I don't want to come here next year and you not be surprised that the unfunded has gone up. Because it probably is going to without any additional funding from the legislature. So, you know, it could potentially be growing for the next 20 to 30 years potentially, depending on the funding we get. But you can see with some of these options that we have, the tier 5, 1.5% COLAs, that dotted green line, we reach a zero unfunded within a 50-year time period. The hybrid even faster in 40 years. The reduced DB plan in, you know, under 50 years as well. So this is even with the current funding of 19.9%. The cash flow, this is an interesting graph because for the hybrid plan, that's the dark blue purple line, that actually gets the worst cash flow over the next 20 years. And that's because the new members are only putting in 4%. So, you know, the contributions coming in are going to be less if the hybrid plan was instituted, but benefit payments really aren't changing. So we're getting in less employee money. So we would need more employer money to kind of offset this. But once you get out 50 years, that's the highest line where we showed you in the graph earlier, where the contributions overtook the benefit payments at that time. This is your dollar amount. It's not really dollar amount, but it's percentage of pay, Dr. McCoy, of where the contribution is going. So you can go back and look at your projection of payroll that's in that table that you love in the report. Look at the payroll for each of these years and you'll be able to get a dollar amount of kind of where you're looking at here.
That's gonna be my legacy, that'll be the McCoy.
The McCoy table, right. But, you know, you're talking 10%, 5 to 10% lower of ADEX in the future based on any of these tiers versus the current tiers plan.
And that's even the case with the negative cash flow for the for the hybrid. That negative cash flow on that other slide is not going to impact.
Right, because what it does is it really is lowering the contribution, the normal cost is so much lower in the hybrid. It's only 1%, we'll get into that, right? But it's so much lower that more of that contribution, the 19.9, is going to pay down the unfunded faster, so you have less of an ADEC. That's why you paid it off in 40 years versus 50 to 60 years for some of the other tiers. So there's more money going towards paying down that unfunded based on these different tiers, based on the normal cost. Now, this last chart is if PERS gets the funding to a phased-in rate of the CAVMAC desired recommendation of 27.9%, that's your dotted blue line. The ADEX really come down. Here they're up over 45, 50%. Here they're 32%. So if this is now getting more dollars in, more funding from the employers, the ADEC goes really far down. And if you look at the hybrid plan, if that was instituted as a tier 5 and the funding went up to 27.9, I could potentially be coming here every year for the next 25 years and not ask for an increase in the ADEC. if the hybrid plan was put in. And you can see some of the other options. It would take a while for, you know, that contribution to even get to 30%. So you'd be looking at much better funding scenarios going forward with having the new tier. So this is the last part of that first slide that we went through is it could potentially limit future increases that are being asked by your actuary.
That's contingent upon funding though, correct?
Yes, this is contingent in getting that 28, almost 28% of pay into the fund.
Or I guess if the ADEC was provided right away, it'd be
Or
similar.
it would be somewhat better, yeah. This is, the blue line is a phased-in approach. That's why it's going up like that over the next 5 years.
So it goes to 20. But where's it go? Down below that, or does it go just to 20%?
What's that?
That percentage? That's is that the ADEC, the percent of?
The blue line is, the blue line
All
is
of them
my
get buried.
phased-in approach. I didn't do the ADEC here.
But all of
think
them
he's
get
talking about it
buried
stopping
at
at
the
20.
cliff. So
oh.
where's how far does the cliff go down?
Normal
If it's not to
cost.
20, okay,
The normal cost, which we'll get to in a slide.
gotcha.
Because that means at that point,
You got
all
all
of
the
those
money,
plans,
all the money in the world.
all of those plans are 100% funded. In 2047, 2048, whatever, yeah, 2047. And you get to your normal cost rates, which are here. So here's a lot of numbers here, but again, we've looked at different scenarios of tier 5 designs. Current tier 4 design, if that was continued, you'd have a total normal cost rate of 12.25. The employee rate is 9, so about 3.25 is being used, is being needed from the employer. And again, I did all this not knowing that the board was gonna vote on going to an ADEC, so this is kind of just still with the current 19.9% if it was included. And you can see that 16.6 is being used to pay down the unfunded. As you get to different tiers, you see more money is being used to pay down the unfunded there, and that's why you pay it down faster, Mr. Benson. So the tier 5, board approved with no COLA, no guaranteed COLA, a 1% guaranteed compounding COLA, and a 1.5% guaranteed COLA. I have it at different normal cost rates total, different employee contribution rates, and then you can see the net employer rate. And then I have the reduced DB plan with a guaranteed 2% COLA at a 7% employee contribution rate. The employer normal cost would be 1.97%.
Refresh my memory from, because we went through all of them.
Yeah.
The 1.5% COLA has an 8-year calculation of high, instead of a high 4, it's got a high 8. Is that the reason?
The hybrid.
No. The tier 5 board approved with a 1.5% COLA. For some reason, that's showing the pay down at 1765 versus the no COLA at 1732.
Probably do with the contribution rate.
Yeah, the employee
Member contribution
contribution.
Oh, 9 and 7, that's the 2%.
So,
that's
yeah,
the
the
2% difference.
employee rate is
Okay,
kept at
that's the
9%.
That's
Yeah.
the 2, okay.
So, you know, our thinking when we were putting this together was if you were to provide new members with no COLA, you know, could you keep the employee rate at 9? Sure. But if you look at that second line there, if you kept the employee rate at 9, that means members would be paying just about 100% of their benefit, you know. Whereas if you're giving a 1.5% COLA, 2% COLA, you could kind of not get away, but you could kind of justify keeping the employee contribution rate at 9%. You know, the benefit's the exact same, they're just getting a less future guaranteed benefit.
But even though more of that is used to pay down the unfunded, it's still because of the projections of having to compound that 1.5% guaranteed.
Right.
It takes long, it still pushes you so
It's-
much further out.
It still
to do-
does,
to-
yeah.
To do the,
Yeah. The only one that really does it the best is the hybrid, and you can see the hybrid, the total normal cost is only 5.25. That's as a percentage of payroll, that's all that plan is worth. Now, this is a much smaller, benefit, a 1% multiplier. So you can see it's kind of half of all the other options. And by employees putting in 4, you've got a lot more employer contribution to pay down that unfunded, and that's why those graphs look the way they do. That's all I had prepared. Do you have any more comments?
No, I
Mr.
do,
Higgins?
no, thank you. Thank you for that. I do have a few comments and thoughts at the proper time, but I'll defer to the chairman of the board first. I'll share a few things now or later.
Any questions from board members, additional questions? Scenarios or? All right, if not, Mr. Higgins?
So one
Thank
little
you,
thank you. One housekeeping note, we've used the terminology today about fixed contribution rate, which of course I understand why we've done that today and in the past. But just as a reminder, with the change in law, we no longer have, I think we have a statutory contribution rate because it's fixed in the statute and will stay there until it's changed. And when you said something earlier, it reminded me.
Exactly right.
So that's why you did it that way. As for the discussion and thoughts on Tier 5, I don't have a recommendation today at this point. I will share a few thoughts. So some, you may want to provide some feedback or thoughts now, maybe later. But one thing I would encourage the board to do is be thinking about how you feel about a hybrid. If, ultimately, at the end of the day, it's the state's responsibility and the sponsor, as we've talked about before, and as we learned this morning, to develop the plan or design the plan. But should state leadership want to pursue a hybrid similar to what we've talked about, be thinking about how you feel about that or what the board may or may not be willing to do as far as supporting that or working with that. That's just something, I don't know if the chairman or if others have any thoughts on that, but that's something I would encourage you to be thinking about. Should the state want to do that, what would the board may or may not want to do? The other thing I would say, a few thoughts, and some of this has been touched on, but I want to highlight them in no particular order. And again, I don't have a recommendation today, but in the context of why should we have a Tier 5? And of course, we've talked about that at length the last 1 to 5 years, so I won't go over all that, but I'll talk about a couple things that I think came out today, and we're going to look at them more in the next month. But realizing that, of course, we all want what is best for Mississippi and for the state and so forth. We all live in a real world, but realizing that our obligation is to the trust, to the membership, and that's our fiduciary role. And it's the state and the employer's responsibility to develop the plan. Given that, if these numbers, as we continue to analyze them, if a hybrid, for conversation's sake, shows that it's better to help, because our loyalty is to the existing membership and the existing trust. So if numbers on a hybrid, and if the state wanted to do that, if those numbers reflect better sustainability for PERS, that may be a good thing. If those numbers reflect paying down the unfunded faster, that's a good thing. And if those numbers help mitigate risks, specifically contribution rate risk, then that's a good thing. So keep that in mind. I'm going to elaborate on that last one. We've all talked about today and in the past about this contribution rate keeps going up. I don't know that that's sustainable. We've had concerns from outside. We've had them amongst yourselves, among board members. Well, none of us can predict the future, and I certainly am not doing that now. But our own projections show that, as many of you, a couple of you have stated today, that if nothing has changed, that ADEC or those contribution rates are projected to grow. Well, if we find that a hybrid option starts to project that to level off or go down, then that may be a way of beginning in conjunction with funding. There's no getting around the funding need. Then that may help mitigate that contribution rate risk. So I got a little longer there than I meant to today, but I would just be thinking about how you would feel if the state wants to pursue a hybrid, and then also be thinking about those 2 or 3 items that do relate to helping the trust and the membership. And I'd be happy to answer any questions on that, but I wanted to leave you with that to be thinking about for now or later.
I would remind everyone that our funding policy says that the board is committed to keeping a defined benefit plan.
Does, I'm just thinking out loud, as we move towards, the state of Mississippi moves towards more people retiring and going back under contract to be able to collect their retirement and basically do 2 checks like many school teachers are doing now. And that begins to erode the number of people coming in, paying into the system. Does the number of state employees continue to drop of those paying in? Does that in any way affect the long-range financial stability of the plan? Does that have any bearing at all? You know, our Republican friends are bragging about that we're reducing the number of state employees. They are, but they're going back to work under contract.
I think it does have a bearing. I mean, the decline in the active population, and sometimes referred to as the declining active to retiree ratio, it does have a bearing. It does have an impact. It's related to some of the stuff that Ed went over earlier to deal with the demographic risk, referring to the active population, contribution risk as well. What I would say and ask Ed to expand on, or at least confirm, is this a factor, and it's an important factor, but I don't know it's as large as the other. I think investments and contributions are the main ones. It does make a difference, but not as large as investments or contributions.
Okay, good.
I think Senator Bryan has maybe talked a little bit about that, surcharge or something, if they actually, if you contract out, that somehow or another the state needs to put in the contract that you're gonna have to, that contract is gonna have to replace lost revenue if they're doing the job of somebody that was employed there. I think he's talked something about that, has he not?
He has, he's talked about a surcharge on whatever, not a set percentage, whether it's 5%, 4%, 10%, whatever it might be, but if an agency or a governmental entity contracted out a service, that there would be a surcharge that would go to PERS. And that's separate and apart from tier 5, but it is something that's probably worth looking at.
Let me ask a question, and I think I know the answer, but I'm not totally sure, and I don't know that there is an official thing, but I want to ask Ed. The hybrid, and as the way it's been analyzed here, is basically half DB, half DC, but still part of PERS and DB. In the industry or in your role, I mean, or to the extent you know about other states, is that considered a defined benefit? I don't know that. I mean, I don't know if there is an official or legal definition, but I know it's half DB at least. But what is it in the industry? If you know, how is that?
It's, well, I consider it still preserving the DB formula because if you consider going just to DC portion, and that's considered closing the DB plan, if you will. That's what we want to avoid here, is closing the DB plan. So by doing a new tier that has a DB component of it, whether it's a hybrid or a pure DB, that's still preserving the DB plan. So, and as long as we can use total salaries to fund PERS from the employer perspective, ADEC, and from the employees, that's the key of maintaining sustainability.
Seems like you've written us a letter to that effect at some point.
Probably, yeah. Yeah, but there's a lot of plans out there that have gone to this hybrid approach.
Go to slide 22 if you would, and I'm going to show the charts that kind of relate. And of course, these come in not long ago, getting ready for the meeting, but there's a couple of charts that relate to what I was referring to that we need to study further. Well, if we have an issue, we don't have to worry about it too bad.
This is me.
Oh.
This is my company. Sorry about that.
No problem. It happens. We all can relate.
Almost got there.
We all can relate.
All right, what was page 22?
It's the ADEC with the funding, I think. The 22 and 23, I was gonna ask about it next too, but I guess we'll. So this is what I was referring to, is under the scenario, if the board has recommended the ADEC to the legislature, should the legislature fund that or the phase-in?
Right.
Then under the hybrid that was analyzed, it shows the ADEC starting to kind of level off and then go down.
Right.
So that's one chart that referred to that I want us to look at further. And then the next one, I think was 23. You and Mr. Benson talked about this a little bit, but with the employer rate being the same, you see in this far right-hand column that a higher amount would go toward paying down the unfunded
Faster.
faster. So, there you go. I was gonna show you that on the chart, but.
Yeah, sorry.
You're on 22, Ray, did you say?
Yeah, slide 22 and 23.
Yeah, and if, on slide 22, again, this is.
Of course, it may not be in there. I
This
don't know
is
that we
the
printed that one.
phased-in approach. If PERS and the legislature agrees to go right straight to the 25.92, these lines will all be lower. Because there will be no phase-in of that. So they all will be lowered a little bit.
But it shows that all the scenarios have the ADEC continuing to grow, whereas the hybrid levels off and goes down.
That's exactly right.
But with a brief comment, I'm not making a recommendation today, and then also the comment that none of us can predict the future, but based on the projections and some of the observations that y'all had.
But we can predict that investment returns don't make any of those any different. They either make them better or worse. All relatively the same, right? I mean, the hybrid doesn't get worse because investments, or better because investments are doing good or not doing as well.
If I understand you right, they would all go up and down the
Right.
same, relatively
I
speaking.
mean, it would just shift.
Yes,
Is that
exactly right.
accurate?
Yeah,
Okay.
if your investments are lower than 7% over the next, everything would shift up.
When they're lower than 7%.
Charles was not in here, so you can't, I don't think. So.
He
Oh,
is,
yes, I
he's-
see him back there. I was blocked. I was blocked.
He's back there out of arm shot.
Sorry, it's back up now.
Okay, yeah. Well, here you can see if you couldn't see, but that's the one, and then if you go
Just did
to.
it again.
No.
It's your laptop, you said?
I guess so, or my internet's gone down.
Well, that covers a few points that I mentioned. Like I said, I don't have a recommendation, just a few thoughts in observing the information and some of your observations and other conversations. And I'd welcome,
One of the things that we're talking about here are new employees. And trying to think back what they said about the fiduciary responsibilities to new participants.
essentially, we don't have any as far as any loyalty.
Okay, so why are we discussing this?
So good point. And, again, today, I don't plan to recommend anything. But the way I would frame that up, and I'm kind of thinking on the fly and framing it in the conversation from the lawyers would be, there is the state statute that gives us the ability or duty to make recommendations as deemed proper. But I would go back to what I just said in that, and I'm not pushing it today or recommending it today, but while we don't have a duty to the new employees, that's ultimately to the sponsor and to the employers. We do have a duty to the current system, the current membership. And so if any of these, including the hybrid, if it helps better sustain the existing system, and if it helps reduce the debt of the existing system, and if it helps mitigate that contribution risk to the existing system, then that's a lot of potential reasons where, although there's not the legal or the fiduciary duty to the new employees, you could have that bridge to how it helps in the duty of loyalty to the existing membership.
See, for me to make a decision about this before I know what the legislature is gonna do for current funding seems to be getting the cart in front of the horse, just a tad for me. If we're forced to do something, I can understand that. And that's the reason I asked the question about what financial advisors say. The legislature understands that a financial advisor, I advise, tells you when you retire, you need to have 80% of your pre-retirement income, okay? This is what we would say to do that. Based on what we're paying our current employees plus the social security, et cetera. We've got a slide 12, I believe, that talks to us about that. So I think that we can talk about what we're doing and still get benefit. It may not be as fast as everybody wants, but it does get us going in that direction, because if we do this before and they say, okay, let's just move it all up to 25%, now all of a sudden, the numbers, as you said, they all come down. They're not up there where they are, so, but, yeah, this is good stuff today, Ed, appreciate you, sharing that with us, especially slide 12, I like that one. That could be McCoy too.
Well, I think it's still yet to be determined or seen as to whether this, whatever the legislature thinks or may decide as maybe a tier 5, would that be, because we don't know yet, at least, would that be that we're just indifferent? Meaning won't oppose it? Does that mean would support it? I think a stretch would be promoting it, because I don't think that would be our role anyway,
I don't think that's
personally.
our role to promote it, no.
Supporting it may be a bit of a stretch, but I think that still remains to be seen too, Dr. McCoy. So, I mean, good point. If the funding's part of that, then it changes those numbers, but I'll also still say we've never met these numbers in my tenure. So I would expect we're not gonna meet them in the future either. So the more conservative we are, the more chances we're gonna hit those numbers. Like on here with the funding, we may be hitting these numbers like this. Because Ed's working in a vacuum, Mr. Perfection, hadn't got it right yet, quite frankly, Ed, I'm just gonna tell you. And I mean that with all due respect, but there are too many conditions, too many factors, and it's been really good for 10 years, all things considered, investment-wise. And we're all somewhat beholden to those investments, like it or not, at this point, they are really what's driving the whole system. So,
My wife got me a button that says, "I'm always wrong."
I mean, you make weathermen look good.
And what is actuaries, I guess, unless it's by coincidence, you are.
Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, earlier, I had talked about 3 projections. In your packet from CAVMAC on page 49 are those projections, the 3 different projections, if you want to see those, I believe. Am I correct, Ed? Are you there yet?
I think he's talking
The
about
different-
the three options.
The different discount rates?
No, he's talking about
It
the one
says
with,
under projection summary,
Oh, yeah.
down here on page 49, I believe.
Oh, 49.
At least that's in my
Oh,
book.
that's in your book. It's
he's
page,
talking about-
page 7 of the.
yeah, the option where you have the extra funding or not, yeah.
Yeah, yep,
It's
I
under
agree, I agree.
It's under projection summary, page 49, I believe, in our books, that have the 3 different,
To have it in both.
or the 2
Yes,
different
you are
scenarios.
exactly right. Have it on page 7 and page 49.
Okay.
I put it in 2 places in case they didn't get to page 49. They stopped before this.
And I guess the only other thing I would say toward those is that, yeah, the employers went to the legislature last couple of years and said, we can't pay this, we can't pay that. If the new tier 5, whatever that may be, is something that they say they can't hire employees with, there's a lot of responsibility over ours of them saying, this won't work and I can't hire. I think they got they've got to carry the load on a tier 5 that they believe, if they believe they can't hire policemen or they can't hire teachers, that employer who at the same time says they can't pay more, is gonna have to either say, yes, I can do this, or yes, I'm gonna have to pay more. You can't have it both ways. And so those employers are gonna have to step up if they don't like what Tier 5 looks like, in my opinion.
No, really good points, and I agree. And even though we spent a lot of time today on other things, funding, in my opinion, is the main thing. Funding
Yes.
is the main message, is the main thing, regardless of any Tier 5 or if there's ever a Tier 5. Funding, as you all acted earlier, is the main thing.
What else from the board? Ray?
That's all we have, I think. If you have any other questions, or if you want to do some modeling or anything, we can, and he's here. But I would just close, if not, by saying Chairman Breland summed up a lot of what I was getting to as well about be thinking about how you feel about it in those different categories.
We'll gather more information, continue to work with leadership to see, feel some of these things out, to see where, what they're thinking. But also, just, and sorry to spring this on you a little bit, Ray, but really for next meeting, I'd like to also for the board to consider whether whether we would be interested in putting in an advisory type council or something, some part of the board, not a voting block, but an investments advisory committee to somewhat of, like Ed has had here with the actuaries and somewhat of peer reviews from that. Have some investment professionals potentially oversee, or I guess peer review, or just look at and see, maybe make recommendations on investments and what may be.
Would you be talking about doing an audit of Callan?
Somewhat, but really more of an investment. As last legislative session, when there was talk of changing the board, there was also some, when things heated up and then started cooling back down, there was somewhat of a suggestion that there could be some advisory members, which from the investment standpoint, at least from my view, is not a bad thing to have more eyes than we have on it. You already got Mr. Nielsen and his staff who are looking over those investments, doing some of them, but very small portion. But for the most part, yes, Dr. McCoy, since Callan is the main driver, that it would be like a peer review of Callan, as somewhat of a independent of Callan, of course, but that would be just something for the board to consider whether we want to put something in place like that or not. Again, from my standpoint, non-voting, obviously, we couldn't have that's established by the legislature is who's on the board, but at least they could advise this board, maybe the investment committee, on what they find or what we may want to consider when it comes to investments.
Well, we do an audit of about that, and how workable would that be, and what would they envision that?
So it could be either.
And see if there's other retirement organizations that do have those sorts of things, and how do they work them?
Right.
So no problem. Happy to work on that and just some initial feedback. And y'all basically got there toward the end. I was hearing hints of different things. One could be a project to do a review or an audit, or essentially a peer review or something of our investment consultant, et cetera, which we could do. I think that what you're referring to may be something that I would, just for conversation's sake, based on that, maybe hypothetically, if the board wanted to do it, you create like similar to the Retiree Insurance Advisory Council, you could create an investment advisory council and appoint 2 or 3 members, or maybe even invite leadership to appoint 2 or 3 members. That would be a advisory council created by the board to give additional advice to the board. I think that's what you were referring
That's
to.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
I really don't want us to have to invent that wheel. I think there's probably some states or pensions that have similar sizes investment groups, and they may do that. And I would ask that staff reach out to those to see what they do and if they have anything. I'd rather us not spend time inventing it if it's already working somewhere.
I have some thoughts on that are not adverse, but and I want to do whatever you'd want, but Mississippi's gonna need to do whatever Mississippi needs to do, I guess, and I'll just leave it at that. Because each state's different, and we're already, well, trying to keep the scope of the, I'm trying to make sure I understand the request and the scope of everything. We're already very much like other public pension systems, and the differences between us and other systems are gonna be just based on the differences and the unique nature of the systems.
Why don't we start, Ray, with seeing whether, because there's nothing that needs to happen by December. It's just to keep some traction on what I think it would be better for this board to come up with before somebody else decides and comes up with it for us.
Sure.
And investments are it. It's driving everything. So the more we're looking within reasonable risk, obviously, those things have been going well. Just wouldn't hurt to have a second opinion, if you will, on maybe certain portions, maybe the entire mix, recommendations or otherwise. And maybe if you don't mind just reaching out to Callan or maybe a couple other pensions that may be similar to ours, just to see whether they do something like that as a peer review. Keep it a little bit simple for the time being.
NASRA may have something.
Sure, well, I was sitting there thinking the same thing. We'll reach out to NASRA and see if there's anybody that has any type of peer review, or a council part, the advisory
Right.
council, or whatever the case may be. Yeah, we'll find some way to do it.
We can start there, and then if we need to change, we can, but just think it's worth us driving some of that compared to not.
Sure. No, I agree, and we're happy to do that.
What else from the board?
Advisory report.
Anything from staff?
No, sir, we appreciate the time.
Okay. Thank y'all very much. We will
Thank you.